If we were to ask you which are the most recognized companies in Europe, many of you would think of Shell, Volkswagen, Maersk, or Nestlé. But, could you tell me what all these companies have in common? The answer is that they all originate from Northern Europe. Shell, for example, was founded in the Netherlands and is currently headquartered in London. Volkswagen is not only the German automotive giant but also the company with the highest revenue in Europe. Maersk, the logistics company whose logo you'll find on thousands of ships, is from Denmark, and Nestlé, the queen of food, is Swiss. The fact is, Northern European nations have an enormous industrial and business power compared to their southern counterparts. In fact, according to Fortune magazine, of the 100 largest companies on the continent, only 13 belong to countries that we could consider southern, such as Spain or Italy. And note, the differences don't stop there. Northern countries are significantly wealthier than those in the south, to the point where countries like Norway have double the GDP per capita of others like Greece. And all this without even mentioning the extremely high levels of unemployment in places like Spain or Portugal, where rates can be up to 3 times higher than in Germany or the United Kingdom. The division between Northern and Southern Europe is omnipresent. If we look within the countries themselves, we'll see the same pattern repeating. The Alpine regions of Italy are more developed than the Mediterranean ones. In fact, Milan, the main city in the north, is more prosperous than Rome, the country's capital. And with this in mind, here comes the million-dollar question: what on earth is happening that the South is synonymous with poverty? Since when has this difference existed? What role do religion or history play in this matter? Today, we'll tell you all about it. Hello to all the community of Finance for All, welcome to another video. Before you say anything, we already know what many of you are thinking: Northern Europe is full of factories, while the South depends on tourism and sectors that don't generate much money. That's the cause of the South's poverty, end of story. Well, no. That has nothing to do with it. In fact, Spain and Italy have much larger industries relative to their GDP than the United Kingdom or France. Even Greece has a more significant manufacturing sector. Okay, so if industry isn't the cause of the divide, could it be that northern countries invest more in education? Well, no, not that either. The rate of university graduates in Cyprus or Spain exceeds that of Denmark, Germany, or Finland. So, what's the correct explanation? Well, friends, the answer lies in history. The economic differences between the north and south of the continent are nothing new. They have existed since the late Middle Ages, and since then, the gap between the two regions has grown ever wider. Historians have dubbed this phenomenon the Little Divergence. It's one of the most important events in Western economic history, and the origin of it all has a name: the bubonic plague. Yes, you heard right, the bubonic plague. If today an Italian is poorer than a German, it's partly because of a plague from 700 years ago. I know, it sounds like a crazy theory, but the bubonic plague transformed European politics and economy. The pandemic killed approximately between 30% and 60% of the European population. That means the number of available workers plummeted. Feudal lords were left without labor, and what did all this imply? Well, wages increased. In places like Florence, they rose between 20% and 80%. The wealthy had to pay a lot to secure scarce labor. It's somewhat like what happens now with programmers. There are very few, but all companies want them, so they end up staying with the ones that pay the most. Ironically, the plague benefited the lower classes who survived. They could save and gain greater economic independence from the wealthy. And you know what? Those lower classes, thanks to their savings, formed a new social class: the bourgeoisie. Merchants, artisans, and blacksmiths, many were able to organize into guilds and cities with their own funds. This is how the free cities like Venice, Genoa, or Amsterdam prospered, regional powers that laid the foundations for Europe's Renaissance. The bourgeois who populated these free cities were known as the new men. However, despite the fact that nearly all of Europe experienced the same increases in income, not everyone was able to translate that income into bourgeois cities. The success of these new men was conditioned by a very simple criterion: Atlantic dominance. Since the Spaniards arrived in America in 1492, the Atlantic Ocean replaced the Silk Road as Europe's main trade route. Cities better connected to the Atlantic, like London or Amsterdam, experienced demographic and economic growth, while European regions like Italy fell into decline. But what about Spain or Portugal? Didn't cities like Seville or Lisbon grow as much as their northern counterparts? The answer is no. While northern territories deployed increasingly massive merchant fleets to dominate Atlantic trade, the kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula stagnated. The question is, why? What prevented the South from deploying its commercial ships and developing its economies? The answer lies in the institutions. If there was anything that fundamentally changed politics in Europe, it was the institutions of the rule of law. Parliaments, independent courts, and even documents similar to constitutions. And friends, that changed everything. With legal limitations, monarchs lost their absolute power. From then on, the bourgeois gained legal security to expand their businesses, not just within their own countries, but also beyond them. And I ask you, can you guess in which countries these types of legal reforms were most widely implemented? That's right, in the regions of Northern Europe. In fact, the British Parliament is one of the oldest democratic institutions in the world. And mind you, we're not talking about a mere paper institution. For example, in 1629, King Charles I decided to raise taxes illegally and arbitrarily. And what happened? His opponents in Parliament rose against him, a civil war broke out, but the parliamentary side eventually emerged victorious. From then on, the separation of powers was further strengthened with the creation of the Bill of Rights and the establishment of the Prime Minister as a counterbalance to monarchical power. But this didn't just happen in the United Kingdom, the same occurred on the other side of the English Channel. In 1581, the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands was established, a bourgeois government through and through, with its own parliament, courts, and even its own stock market. With the founding of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange in 1602, the Dutch nation holds the distinction of not only founding the world's oldest financial market but also establishing the first capitalist economy in history. As you can imagine, the story in southern Europe was entirely different. In Spain and Portugal, the crown dominated the economy. Colonial trade was controlled by a colossal bureaucratic network through which the monarchs restricted economic activities solely for the benefit of the government itself. For example, the spice trade was monopolized by the Portuguese East India Company, whose shipments had to be sold, by law, through a public institution called the House of India. In Spain, the same happened. Colonial trade was a monopoly of the Casa de Contratación in Seville. It didn't seem like a particularly conducive environment for the development of the bourgeois class or a prosperous economy, did it? But even with all this, we're still missing the cherry on top, the last factor that explains the little divergence: religion and education. You see, although today the educational differences between Southern and Northern Europe are not entirely clear, it wasn't always like that in the past. English, Dutch, Danish, and German societies were much more cultured and technically trained than Spanish or Italian society. Now, we're not saying that Italy and Spain didn't have their respective academic achievements. After all, during those years, the Italian Renaissance and the Spanish Golden Age were at their peak. However, who were the ones who could study? Who had access to education? The answer is the wealthy, the aristocrats. The lower classes were relegated to illiteracy. However, in Northern Europe, that wasn't the case. The Northerners worked hard to educate all layers of their society. For example, in the Netherlands, the number of books read per thousand inhabitants increased from 0.2 in the 14th century to more than 500 by the mid-18th century. Other places like Sweden or England are also worth mentioning. But, as expected, the Mediterranean regions once again lagged behind. Greater education not only generated positive economic returns by increasing productivity but also gave a large number of people the opportunity to rise socially. And believe it or not, these levels of education weren't the result of generous social plans or new urban wealth. We have religion to thank. During the 16th century, Europe was divided between Catholics and Protestants. And there was one thing that changed everything: the translation of the Holy Scriptures from Latin to the common language. The Protestants wanted the Bible to be translated and, moreover, for the people to be educated so they could read and interpret it for themselves. As you can imagine, the Catholic Church didn't take kindly to losing its total monopoly on interpreting the Scriptures, so both religious movements fell into endless conflict. Thus, while in Catholic countries those who tried to translate or interpret the Bible were persecuted, in Protestant countries, there was an incentive to educate as many people as possible. And where were the Protestants? Exactly, in places like Sweden, the United Kingdom, or the Netherlands, northern regions that established massive literacy programs and mandatory education. In fact, the first country on the continent to establish a system of compulsory education was Denmark, a Lutheran-majority country, where as early as 1539, laws were enacted requiring every town to have a minimum number of schools. Practically no Catholic-majority country reached the literacy rates of the Protestant powers on the continent, and the difference persisted until the 20th century. I mean, even France, with its centralized administration and economic power, couldn't surpass the tiny Protestant German states. Conclusion: with a greater number of people having access to education, there was also an increase in the number of people who could engage in trade, craftsmanship, or finance. In other words, the power and independence of the already known bourgeoisie expanded, which inevitably led to significant economic growth. In any case, friends, these are just some theories that might explain the divergence between the South and the North. Economic history isn't always an exact science, but today we've certainly learned some interesting things. On the one hand, the bubonic plague increased wages and savings, which in turn led to the creation of the bourgeois class. Areas with more contact and freedom in Atlantic trade had more economic advantages. And finally, the Protestant Reformation ignited the spark of literacy in Northern Europe. But now, having seen all these theories, what do you think? Can you think of other reasons that explain the differences between Northern and Southern Europe? Do you agree with the reasons we've given in this video? Share your thoughts in the comments section.